Welcome to the Uncharted podcast. I am your host, Inés Franklin. My hope for you today is that we discover faith beyond the boundaries. Uncharted is intended to be a safe place for you to listen, learn, and challenge yourself along your journey of faith. May grace and peace be with you today. Welcome to the show. Welcome. You're in for a treat today as we enter into a conversation with Joshua Porter about his book, Death to Deconstruction, Reclaiming Faithfulness as an Act of Rebellion. Now, how's that for a provocative book title? And it's an excellent book. Josh is vulnerable with his story. He's a wonderful Bible teacher, but also a great storyteller. And as you read this book, you're just really taken in as you learn about what it's like for a person to go through a season of disorientation on their journey of faith. Now, this is not new to us. All of us will experience struggles on our journey of faith, but often we don't talk about it. And I love that Joshua talks about it not only in this podcast, but also deeply in his book, very, very honestly and raw. It's a challenging book, it's a provocative book, but also a beautiful book and a beautiful picture of the journey of faith and the way that God meets us there and walks with us there. Now, this was my first time meeting Josh, so maybe this is your first time as well. Let me tell you about him. He is pastor of teaching and creative vision at Van City Church in Vancouver, Washington. He's also a former member of the experimental art punk band Showbread and the author of the novel Punk Rock versus the Lizard People. He is a very interesting person, very kind, very generous with his time and his story and his very brilliant mind. So I hope you'll completely be blessed as you listen to this podcast, and also that you will share it with others so they too will be blessed. Now let's listen in. So good to be with you. Josh, as I was reading your book, I want to start by saying thank you. So a little bit about me so you understand my context, and then we'll dive into what you're saying. So I grew up in the Catholic Church as a little kid, going to Catholic Church. But pretty much by the time I was 9, I stopped going and didn't really become a believer until I was 40. And here in California at an evangelical non-denominational church. And then always been very interested in the next generation, what they're thinking. It's always something that's my passion. And watching so many young people start using this term deconstruction. And I started to look at this subject more carefully to understand what was happening. And I noticed a pattern, and that was that the wave going from what they were rejecting to what they were going towards seemed just as stifling to me. And I was concerned. I was very concerned for, you're just replacing one thing for the other, but I didn't have the language. I didn't know how to talk to them about that. And as I read your book, you gave so much language to some of the thoughts I had and some of the concerns I had for those who are either in the middle of it or have been through it, are wounded, and are trying to find their way. So I'm just very grateful for your book. And I really pray that it's challenging, it's provocative. You share so much about your story. Beautiful. I love how you added the little narrative along the way with the apprentice and the master. So it was fun to read, in addition to being interesting and very, very provocative. So I hope many, many people read this book. And they, like you say, I think I heard you say this in another podcast, there'd be a new revival of people fighting the Lord.
Yeah, I think, that's, the book is my story. So I can relate from the inside looking out to what you're saying, and that I felt as if the journey of deconstruction was, at least my version of it, was ultimately unfulfilling before I arrived where I have arrived. And in what feels like innumerable conversations I've had over the years, I've talked to so many people who are either my age or much younger than me, and are either in that uncomfortable ambiguity or are on the precipice of something else. They've already moved beyond deconstruction and I think come to terms with its ultimate untenability in that it's not sustainable long term and are in want of something else. Maybe they don't know exactly what it is, and that's where I've been as well. And there was probably a time where I felt very pessimistic about the whole thing, even post deconstruction, becoming a pastor, settling in what I describe as the ancient historic Orthodox movement of Jesus, where I felt deeply pessimistic about the entire, you might call it a movement or a fad or the pendulum swing, generational pendulum swing. I don't really feel that way anymore over the course of my experience is obviously narrow. It's just my experience. But over the course of so many conversations, and especially since the book's come out and I've talked to people who are either in the throes of deconstruction themselves or have a similar story or just know someone who has a story like it, that's not the greater picture I'm seeing anymore. I'm seeing what feels to me, I don't mean to sound all inspiration, after school special or something like that. But it feels to me like revival is something of an inevitability. Not across the board. I think that we will continue to wrestle with people bailing out on faith in Jesus as we have for hundreds and hundreds of years. But the kind of modern Western movement of deconstruction, I don't think will be around. Yeah, I'm not a social commentator or anything or a sociologist, but I don't know that it'll be around in the same way when our kids are adults or their kids are teenagers, if that makes any sense.
It does. In fact, part of because I myself, in a way, without having the language, or I went through that when I was 7 years old. I went through, I use the term, I just finished writing the manuscript for my book. It's going to come out in March. And in my book, I use the word disorientation. It's actually a Grudem term. Disorientation in that place of faith where you just get confused. You get confused, you get hurt, you get angry, you get disappointed, and you get lost. Oh, there's so many words of what it feels like to be there. And I was 7 years old when I went through it. Thomas went through it in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, right? And this is part of the human faith journey that we will feel that loss at times. What made me sad about the deconstruction as a term and as a season or whatever it is that it felt like a death. It felt like so many people were really losing their faith altogether. And so that of course makes me sad, and I went through that too. So anyway, this is such an important book. I want to dive in a couple of things that you did here. You point out to these great predators that threaten our faith. And those are not new. I don't think they're new. Even the politicized Christianity, I'm sure that happened in the first century, right? Maybe not, doesn't look like it is for us today. But these are not new issues. And yeah, talk to me about how do you see these predators being there really all along from the early stages of any faith, really?
That's a great point, I think. I mean, and it lends itself well to what you said about disorientation, which is a great word to describe the inevitable experience of anyone who seeks out to follow Jesus, or really anyone who takes up any kind of faith at all, in that we're finite and we lack metaphysical certainty about any given thing that we decide to believe. So that sort of disorientation, that wrestling with what it is that we will or won't believe or can and can't believe, is not just ordinary, it's inevitable, a part of anyone's journey of what I would describe spiritual formation, or what someone else might just say maturing and growing as a person and in a person's faith. So yeah, it comes as no surprise that the great predators that I've outlined in the book, which are sort of the most cited issues that derail faith in my personal experience, having conversations as a pastor and just as human dude who follows Jesus with other people who are trying to follow Jesus or who don't follow Jesus. When you ask them what is the thing that is most inhibiting your ability to not just believe, as if belief is never an obstacle. Belief is always going to be a wrestling and growing and disorienting at times. But what is it that feels as if it stands in between you and faith, you and I'm going to be a Christian and follow Jesus? And things like the problem of evil, things like hypocrisy in the church or amongst, the church's leaders and figureheads down throughout church history. Things like politicized faith. And yeah, absolutely. And if not earlier, certainly by the time that, Constantine legalized Christianity in the Roman Empire and sort of domesticated Christianity as a politicized civil religion. That's a very long time ago, so that's nothing new. Christian nationalism is a big conversation at the moment in the West, but it has very deep, and I argue in the book, very sinister roots, going back hundreds and hundreds of years. These are all things that all disciples of Jesus have been. Certainly self-denial, which is in my book the last of the great predators, has been not just a stumbling block, but maybe the core issue that keeps people from discipleship to Jesus. As early as Jesus walking around the ancient Mediterranean saying, ancient Palestine, being like, hey, come follow me, but you have to die first, and having so many people say, oh, well, geez, I had no idea.
Never mind.
I'm not doing that. But I liked what you had to say until you came out with the whole take up a cross thing. So they're not new. And to me, that is comforting rather than discouraging. These are ancient issues that would-be disciples of Jesus struggled with 2,000 years ago, and that we're still struggling with today, which means that we have such a great resource in church history and a wealth of writing from, the church fathers and mothers all across the world and all sorts of different traditions and backgrounds. I have a book on my desk right now that's called A Monastic Handbook for Combating Demons. And it's just a book of scripture citations for monks as they battle various temptations. And you read it, it feels antiquated, not in a bad way, but it feels very old. And it's hilarious to me that at the time of writing, the issues for, like combating the demon of fornication or some such thing are still the issues that we're having conversations with, writing books about, having podcasts about. Which means that we have not just the immediate family of God in the church, but we have a rich history throughout the Orthodox Christian tradition to draw on, to learn from, which makes the struggle no less a struggle, but it makes it a struggle that we can endure as a family and as a tradition, rather than as kind of isolated individuals. The deconstruction movement kind of thrives on hyper-individualism in the pulling the person away from the camp or the tribe or the family, and raising from structures, which probably has roots in things like critical theory, which kind of has a suspicion of anything that's any system that has any kind of power in the cultural sphere. And there's some truth to that, that systems can and are often corrupt, and that's especially powerful systems can be and often are corrupt. But it inevitably raises the bar on the individual. The individual becomes the arbiter of truth versus lies, of right versus wrong, and the kind of truth of the individual becomes subject to the individual themselves. And we have expressions and catchphrases for things like this, like, find your own truth, and this is my truth, and what makes you happy, as if truth is kind of relative to the individual, and what's true for one person isn't true for another person. And ultimately, people can't carry out this worldview with any kind of consistency, because it just doesn't work itself out. We all believe that something is true and something else isn't true. And we probably, many of us would not be comfortable with saying something like this out loud, but everyone believes that it would be better if other people agreed with them about the things that they believe are true. And we have ways of communicating that to the public through things
very passionately.
Very passionately. Yeah.
Through Twitter and all that.
Yeah, and so it becomes this kind of, the deconstruction, and I'm oversimplifying, but for the sake of time, the the deconstructionist community kind of purports, or at least in my experience when I was going through it, purports this um, untenable idea of, what I've called a personal pan spirituality. Like, you can just find the things that work for you and they can be true for you. And it doesn't matter if they're not true for everyone else, they'll be true for you. But then sort of cannibalizes itself, trying to domineer the public with its own idea of what's true and what's false, which is manifest in things like, outrage culture and cancel culture and the fundamentalism that was on the right when I was a kid and now is on the left as I'm an adult. So all that to say, these issues, the issues that confront faith and the way that we wrestle through them, either correctly and maturely, or poorly and immaturely, haven't really changed all that much. The vehicles that we use to express them, the way that we communicate them, and the way that they express themselves in our culture may have changed a lot, but the issues themselves are kind of mainstays to the human experience.
Which is why I like your use of the term predator, because it is a consistent predator, right? The environment is different in the particulars, but it is a very consistent. The John 10:10, the enemy comes, right? He has one intent. He doesn't have any new tricks. He uses the same tricks for millennia, and so I really like that. I really appreciate it too that you have self-denial as part of that list, because especially for our individualistic culture, it was hard even in the context of the communal culture where Jesus was, right. But it's even harder the more individualistic we become, because it makes no sense to die for something else.
It doesn't, no. And it's so hard to, and I'm a part of this too. It's hard for us, especially in the Western world and as Americans especially, to conceive of a world in which our highest joy and most complete, versions of ourselves can be realized in self-denial. We're kind of given a paradigm at birth, regardless of, this was my world, and I grew up in the church, and regardless of upbringing, in the wallpaper of Americana is, well, the highest realization of the self is the freedom to do whatever you want and be whoever you want. And the way of Jesus comes into that, or comes up against that, and says, not only is that not true, but there may be and are things about your innate wiring and your disposition and who you feel, quote unquote, naturally you are to be, that Jesus might ask you to deny or set down in the name of apprenticeship. And the paradigm we're given is that anything or anyone that would have us deny part of ourselves is not just wrong, it's oppressive and dangerous. And so, I agree with you that the language of predator was on purpose, and it is a nod to the word picture of the devil as a lion. And there were people who wanted me to include a chapter or a section on things like sexuality or gender, some of the more current topics that are pervasive in the deconstruction conversation. And the more I tried to take on those particular things, the more I realized that so many of them are couched under the greater question of self-denial, or whether or not it is right or good to surrender part of your own autonomy in the name of something greater than yourself. And the reason that I included it with the predators is because I think that, in my worldview, in my theology, the devil uses even the instruction of Jesus as a stumbling block to tear people, like, from the very beginning, from the opening pages of the scriptures. And it's like God gives instruction, it's good instruction, and the devil comes along, in this particular story as a snake, to say like, oh, well, he said this, but this thing's not good. And so we probably shouldn't trust him. So the thing itself, the good thing itself, becomes twisted as something that leads us astray rather than toward the truth. Self-denial being there was the reason it came at the end. I figured if I put that at the beginning of the book, no one would finish the thing.
Well, and your message, I'm curious about how it has been received. It's obviously provocative to both sides of the conversation, whether those who have been like, yeah, I've been warning you about those deconstruction people,
Yep.
and those who have gone through it or in the middle of it, probably some might go, yep, I totally see that. And some might totally disagree with you. How has that been for you? What kind of feedback are you getting from either side? Because you're
Oh,
trying to middle here,
I
which is
am.
always the worst part to be.
It
Right there
is,
with
yeah.
Jesus.
And I'm a hypocrite as well because I kind of tout myself as a provocateur, and if nothing else, just by writing a book like this and
Yeah.
calling it something like Death
And
of
the title.
Deconstruction.
And
Yeah,
the
yeah.
title. Hello.
I know. I know. So, and I mean, I don't regret things like that. I don't regret calling the book what I called it, and I don't regret writing a book that's decidedly provocative. Mostly because aesthetically, that's what I find most interesting as an artist before I'm a pastor or into theology or something like that. This is the book that I like to read as a reader of books. So I write the thing I'd like to read, and then I sort it out when after the book is out there in the world and people start fighting about it. Mostly, I will say that at least what's come back to me has been very positive and very gracious and very, very encouraging and very humbling. But anyone who's ever, you're writing and have a book coming out, you know that anyone who's ever made anything will tell you that you can read like, 100 good emails or reviews or whatever, and then read the one really mean negative one, and that's the thing that takes root in your mind. I
Yes.
guess psychologically, there's neuroscience to back this up, and so there have been people who are not happy, and funnily enough, on either side. And I realize again, I don't like to use those simplistic kind of tribal terms, but meaning I've gotten letters from people or read bad reviews from people who are like, "Oh, this guy, he's a progressive quack. You know, he's out there in left field or something like that. He's pretending to be orthodox, but he's not." And then I've gotten more angry emails or bad reviews from people who are like, "This guy is pretending to be open-minded, but he's really a conservative fundamentalist," and he just wants to beat us over the head with his view of the Bible or whatever it is. Which ordinarily I take those kinds of concurrent criticisms in stride, because I hope, and I don't mean to sound like, oh man, I hit the nail on the head or anything like that, but if I'm doing a relatively decent job, especially in a conversation like this one, it probably should kind of conjure
Handle.
the outrage of people who are on either side of the extreme, at least to a certain degree. You don't write something just to make people upset, but I think I'd be a little more discouraged if all the criticism was of one particular shade rather than two really, really different camps who are both criticizing me for reasons that sound like I should be on either one of their sides, but I'm not. So I wish I could say that I was above it all and none of it ever hurt my feelings, but every now and then you read something that you're like, "Oh, ouch," and then other
It
times
stinks.
I've had conversations with people that I think I take people off guard because they write angry things online, and sometimes I'll see it and reply and not be mean, and they're like, "Oh, I forgot there was a human on the other side of this thing," so they often adjust their tone or they apologize. And internet or digital conversation and feedback and even critique of things like books, which is not necessarily in and of itself bad, but it can be so objectifying. And we often, I mean, I consume entertainment and art, and I say like, "Oh, it was good" or "it was bad." They did a good job or a bad job, and we often forget there are people on the other side of these things. So it's been, all that to say, it's been a whirlwind of different kinds of reactions, most of which that have come back to me have been very positive, but some, predictably volatile.
Yes, exactly. No, you chose to write this. You tell your story. You have, like I said, a little bit of a fiction story that carries through the book. Um, there's a great deal of teaching and instruction, and there's an artistry in the way that you kind of organized it. And so, can you can you give me a sense for, because I think I heard you mention in another podcast that you prefer nonfiction writing, and this here you obviously is a nonfiction book with a lot of artistry. Can you tell me a little bit about like what prompted this book for you, and what are you hoping for that it will accomplish?
Yeah, I think of myself primarily as a novelist. I've written more novels than I've written nonfiction, and I don't think that I had much interest in nonfiction as a writer, not because I think that it's less than fiction, just because, everyone has preferences and I like to read novels. As a pastor and whose job it is to teach Bible and theology every week, I have to read so much, theology and Bible scholarship every single week just to write a sermon that I kind of don't read it for fun anymore. I read it on my desk at my office at work, and when I read for pleasure, I read fiction. Um, but there was, I don't want to describe it as pressure, maybe I should say encouragement from friends of mine who, when I would sort of get on the soapbox about this particular issue, they would say, "Oh, you should write these things down. This should exist in a single volume." And I decided that it might be worth a shot. And honestly, when sitting down to write, if you're not deeply familiar with Christian nonfiction, I think of myself as relatively familiar, but I don't read a ton of, for fun, Christian nonfiction. So it's a daunting task to be like, I don't know, well, how do I do that? I felt as if I had like a bit of imposter syndrome. I had, like, how am I supposed to do this? And I started to read and do research for, well, maybe I would like to write this kind of book. And I reread a few memoirs that from Christian writers who I think are a little more literary, like the Brennan Mannings of the world or Flannery O'Connor. And those were really inspirational. And I had no intention of writing anything memoir-esque. The original version of the book, I think even the version of the book that I sold to a publisher, was more like a theology book. It was like, it had bits and fragments of story in there and biography in there, but for the most part, it was theological arguments for, the great predator stuff, the issues that derail faith. But I ended up reading stacks of men. I read Dorothy Day's memoir, and like I said, Brendan Manning, Flannery O'Connor, or Eugene Peterson. These kinds of people who wrote biographically and did theology in their biographies, and found that so much more interesting. Usually because there's a narrative thread as opposed to a collection of theological essays. So I decided to steal that idea. But even when I sat down to kind of steal the whole memoir or theology book hidden in a memoir idea, I still had no idea how I was going to put all the pieces together. And what came out and what I handed out, the first draft that I handed to the publisher, I was like, oh my God, I did something that wasn't even in the proposal. I hope that they're not going to say, never mind, forget it. There was like a fiction in there and all kinds of weird stories from my own life and kind of this narrative thread and stuff that I didn't say I was going to do, I ended up doing. But it worked out. I had no idea if it was even working at all until I got endorsements back from writers that I like. Because, my wife said she liked it, but what does that mean? She likes me. And
That's nice.
I have a writing workshop with some good friends of mine. And I think that they're very honest. They gave me very honest critiques about the manuscript, but they also love me. When you love someone, it's hard to be completely, objective about the thing. But then some folks that don't know me at all wrote back and said nice things. So I was like, oh my God, thank you. It worked. It worked. at least what I was trying to do worked. That doesn't necessarily mean it's any good, but the thing I set out to do, I somehow did.
Yeah. Well, it made for a very, very enjoyable read, and it made your theological points well illustrated. In a way, that's kind of how sermons work as well, right? Where we try to illustrate these points in a way that connects with people's lives and stories.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I thought you did that really well, including sharing some very vulnerable parts of your story, and your own struggle with self-loathing and some of these things that you experienced, and including the possibility of taking your life. I relate to that. That's how I wrote my book as well. And that's how I started my spiritual journey at 7 years old, wanting to go to heaven immediately instead of waiting until God decided the timing. I just felt
Wow.
like heaven sounded pretty awesome. Why not go today? Um, and I think at some point we do have to kind of come to a conclusion as to why we live,
Mm-hmm.
why live. And um, so yeah, thank you for sharing vulnerably. I felt like I connected to you in a different way that if you were just teaching theology. I
Yeah.
read nonfiction all the time. It's really refreshing to have, nonfiction. It's refreshing to have a nonfiction book that also takes me on a story.
Yeah. The including the deeply personal stuff isn't always the most fun. I guess I should say it's
Very,
yeah, it when it's in the writing phase and you're alone and you're writing it down, it feels creatively satisfying and even cathartic in a way. And then at some point you finish a draft and you realize someone else is going to have to read this thing. And when you do fiction, you can hide behind metaphor and symbolism and allegory. And when you do nonfiction, especially autobiographical nonfiction, it's so naked and so it feels very raw. Um,
yeah,
and there was a draft that had none of that stuff in it. None of the. It still had biographical stuff in it, but it did not include the wrestling with self-loathing or the suicidal ideation, stuff like that. And I had finished it and reread it and realized that the story, as it were, kind of concluded with me deciding to be a Christian, and then it ended. It ended as if nothing bad happened after that, or no further wrestling took place other than what I inferred was inevitable for all disciples of Jesus. And it felt like I had been very personal about struggling as a kid, as an adolescent, as a teenager, as a young adult, but had not been vulnerable about struggling as a pastor, a father, a husband. And the obvious place to go was where I went, but I mean, I don't mean to over spiritualize it, but I actually was having conversations with God and saying like, I'd really prefer not to put this in here, not because oh, I'm just so embarrassed, but it'll mean I'm going to have so many conversations with people that know me, and at that time, the things that I say in the book were unknown to anyone but me and God.
mm,
Um,
mm,
and that did not sound fun. So
right.
I fought with him about it for a while, and I didn't feel as if God was saying like, "Look, you have to put this stuff in here, or I'm going to somehow stop this book," or something like that. I just felt as if, in the loving, gentle, fatherly way, he appeals to my own brokenness sometimes by saying like, "Look, you want to be sincere and authentic. This is the way to do that. If you don't, there will be some degree of inauthenticity to this book." So then I'm like, "Oh, fine, great. I guess you got me. I don't want to be inauthentic, so I'll put it in there." And the surprising thing is that the reaction to those things in particular has been, what you're saying. And I thought mostly selfishly about the way people would think about me reading them, and I did not think about the way people would think about themselves reading those
Yeah.
stories. And that has been deeply humbling and beautiful and encouraging. So yeah, I'm glad I listened, even though it's still not that fun. But you understand.
Right. Well, and you feel naked before people and
Yeah,
so vulnerable. But I mean, self denial is one of those predators, right? And it's another form of self denial. If we're trying to truly point to Jesus with our writing and our stories and what we're trying to teach, um, yeah, probably the most, and we can't make it pure. We're corrupted individuals. We're going to corrupt it even in our attempt to be pure.
right.
But to the extent that we can be willing, at least willing to self denial, even in that, I mean, for me, God has called me time and time again to share things that I don't tell people they need to do this, but I know God called me to do this,
Right. Yeah.
and yeah, like you said, it increases conversations that sometimes I don't want to have, if I'm honest.
Right. Yeah.
But I know that God's doing something and it's pointing to Him at the end of the day. So And
Yes, he
yeah,
has a funny
thank
sense
you.
of humor, and then
Yeah.
has a way of encouraging us even in our wrestling with his instruction.
Yes. In fact, I wanted to talk about the wrestling piece. I have a few people in mind specifically who are wrestling. Again, I'm not sure if I read this in your book or you mentioned it in some other podcast that I listened to, but um, the let me gather my thoughts. But the constancy. English is not my first language, but I digress. I think you understand me.
I think that's
Of
great.
wrestling on the journey, that wrestling is very much part of the journey. Talk to us about that. I found that is a very thoughtful way to look at it because so many people feel, well, if I'm wrestling, then my faith is not there. People get told that as well. Well, you're wrestling, so you lost your faith or you're losing your way. Watch out. There's we don't embrace or even walk with people who are wrestling, and yet it's very much part of the journey.
It is, and it's amazing to me that I honestly doubt that if you went and took a survey of people who are either Christian or familiar with, church culture and Christianity, even in the West in America, I honestly doubt that you'd get a lot of people saying that their understanding is post conversion life becomes an effortless, sort of downhill journey toward sanctification, and that it's not hard and nothing bad ever happens. I doubt people consciously make that statement or argument, and yet we seem to operate under some kind of subconscious understanding that it's true, at least to some degree, and that doubt, for example, is always the enemy of faith rather than an inevitable aspect of the faith journey, or that wrestling always indicates some kind of lapse in faithfulness or is always necessarily indicative of sin or faithlessness. And around the time I was sort of outlining the book and trying to figure out how to take it on, I read a children's adaptation of The Pilgrim's Progress to my kids, which is this beautiful little volume called Little Pilgrim's Progress with these beautiful illustrations of the, Christian is a rabbit, I believe, and and he encounters different, woodland creatures along the way. But it was faithfully adapted, and it was interesting. And they were really, it was a chapter book, so we'd do a chapter night. They were always doing, like, come on, one more chapter kind of thing. This was on the heels of reading them, like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and walking them through the idea of allegory and symbolism. And so I want my kids to be art literate. And uh, it struck me how beneficial it is to have works like these, which depict the journey of faith and discipleship to Jesus as inherently dangerous and wild and conflicted and frightening at times, or uh, that not everyone makes it. That it's this perilous kind of epic meta narrative that a lot of people picked up on the similarities between the Apprentice thread in Death Deconstruction, the similarities to Pilgrim's Progress, and I wanted something that depicted discipleship as an inherently dangerous,
Yeah.
challenging journey rather than kind of a static state of being. That's the subconscious idea that I think has been imbibed in church culture, is that, like, well, whether or not you're Christian is basically something you can check on a box, meaning you believe one thing and not another thing. It's just sort of a static statement of belief rather than a dynamic way of life with all sorts of oscillating uphill, downhill, good, bad seasons, doubt, despair, wrestling, joy, ecstasy, euphoria, all the human experience doesn't
Yeah.
end when you decide to follow Jesus. If anything, it becomes even more harrowing, but
Yes.
incredible, beautiful. That I think often the highs are higher, the lows are lower, the valleys are even more trying, and because it becomes the existential angst of, like, the soul and wrestling not just with yourself and your place in the world, but with the God of the universe. It's really this epic journey, not whether or not you happen to believe God exists and have prayed a magical prayer at some point in your life to invite Jesus into your heart as your personal Lord and Savior. And that kind of idea that, oh, I prayed a prayer and I believe a certain thing about God and or Jesus, that Jesus is Messiah. I just got a letter the other day from someone who was wrestling with the idea of orthodoxy, that there is sort of a standard of belief shared by Christians around the world for centuries, and that even though orthodoxy is a broader place than many people have been led to believe, it does have boundaries, and that you can step beyond those boundaries and no longer belong to the ancient historic Jesus movement. And he was asking, well, isn't it enough to just say, I just believe Jesus is the Messiah? Does there really need to be anything else? And I think even something like that, which this was a really thoughtful dude who was entering into a really nuanced conversation, but even something like that kind of betrays the idea that can't I just believe a thing rather than go on the journey of spiritual formation, which has to do with belief. It's not less than belief, but it's so much more than that. I wanted to depict faith and apprenticeship as the harrowing journey, which is another reason that I included the deeply personal stuff, because my fight against deconstruction, which, if you read the book thoughtfully, the people that are mad at me are often most mad about the title. But if you read the book thoughtfully, it begins with kind of a narrow standard of what deconstruction is, or definition of what deconstruction is. And that definition begins to broaden the more the narrative moves forward. And there's foreshadowing of that in the beginning. I talk about suicide as the ultimate deconstruction, which does not fit with the narrow definition I give at the beginning, but does fit with the broad definition that's been revealed by the end of the narrative. And my wrestling against the ultimate deconstruction, did not end even when I became deeply committed to orthodoxy. Right now, as a disciple of Jesus, my battles aren't necessarily day to day against the great predators I've outlined in the book, save self-denial. That thing never goes away. It's against us all the time. But, mostly, and this could change in a different season of my life, but mostly I have a confident and comfortable theology of things like the problem of evil, or the role of the Christian in politics, or even hypocrisy. It doesn't mean that those things never bother me, or that I never wrestle with them ever again, but they don't trip me up the same way that they did in earlier stages of my life or apprenticeship. But that does not mean that the faith journey is somehow settled. As a pastor, and as a father and a husband, I have wrestled against things that have been even more difficult. And they turn out to be things like self-loathing, not like, I don't know how to read this passage in the Bible. So the faith journey does not somehow, you arrive at, thank God I got this mature. Now there's no more struggle at all. And reading some of the modern and historic figureheads or heroes of the Christian movement, the great fathers and mothers and writers and thinkers, reading their stories, you read the prayer journals of someone like Flannery O'Connor, or you read, the memoir of Brendan Manning is anything but a comfortable experience. It's harrowing, and it's upsetting and frustrating, and these are people that I think of as Christians, and or even the journals of I talk about this in the book, the journals of someone like Mother Teresa.
That's right.
They're
years of silence.
Yes, they're so upsetting, and then strangely comforting, because there's solidarity that we have, that she's like me, I'm like her. So I think, again, it seems like these things could be discouraging to learn that the journey of faith never levels out all the way. But I take a strange kind of comfort in the idea that, okay, it's not just me, and I'm not alone. I'm on this journey with other people, and it doesn't drop to the depths of despair and stay there. It comes up again. And even though I know that suffering is inevitable and that suffering comes, I also know how to walk through that with other people. And I know that there are people who will walk with me, and I know how to relate to God in those things. And so there's a kind of comfort in accepting that wrestling is, a mainstay of the Christian movement.
I call it the blessing of the wrestle. The blessing because the story of Jacob wrestling with God I just preached on that not too long ago, and I hadn't really caught on this, but before the wrestle that Jacob did with the angel, he spoke of God as the God of, always speaking about the God of Abraham, the God of our fathers. But after that wrestle, it was my God, the God of Jacob,
Oh,
the
wow.
God of Israel. And it's very distinct in this narrative of Genesis, that shift from one moment to the next. And until we accept that wrestle, we can't see God as my God, the way David describes him.
Oh, wow. That's
Um,
beautiful. Yeah, totally.
and yeah, and so that's why I call it the blessing and the wrestle. And I am 100%, I'm sitting here trying to have self-control, listening to you well, because I'm like, yes, preach it, say it louder, louder, louder. Because that's, my book is called Uncharted, and it is navigating your unique journey of faith. And it starts out by saying, it's time we tell the truth. The journey of faith is a mystery. Jesus,
Yes.
when he calls us, as Bonhoeffer said, he bids us to come and die. And it's not what you hear in churches when they're doing the altar call. It's like, come on forward, come and self die. So it wouldn't be popular. But I remember when I became a believer, at first I felt relief. And then I felt this sort of like, man, this is hard. This is going
Hmm.
to be hard. And having to decide to commit to it, for me, it was a moment of, well, I've already tried everything else, and I know where that landed me. I'm going to commit to this, and I'm going all in. And God has taken me on a wild ride as I'm doing that. But so, really, I think your book, and I think what I'm trying to do with my book, is to call people to a commitment to be in. It's like Jesus saying, "Are you going to leave too?" Kind of like, "Well, who do you say that I am?" It's like he's asking the same questions today to all of us, constantly on this very mysterious journey with them. So I really appreciated that you talked about the mystery on the journey. I love in the allegory that you shared the story of the food, the hunger. This one I really love, the forbidden fruit.
Hmm.
That the hunger doesn't go away. So in my book, I talk about the thirst, um, inspired by Psalm 63, when the psalmist is saying he's in this place of absolute thirst, and but I believe that's a constant condition that we're in until we're fully in the presence of God, or Jesus comes back and evil is once and for all conquered. Um, we are in this state of hunger and thirst for God, and if we try to run from that, that's when we get into trouble. We're trying to just say, well, if I do this, then that will stop. Well, while he feeds our hunger and he quenches our thirst at the same time, he increases our thirst and he increases our hunger.
Yeah, I
That's
agree. Yeah, and I love that. I think it's not enough in my mind anyway to write and talk about something like deconstruction or even wrestling and doubt without giving a sort of uncensored paradigm for the cost of faithfulness. And I
yeah,
love that you use Bonhoeffer's quote, that thing. I mean, geez, that didn't sell then, it doesn't sell now. When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. And it's
nice
one
big
reason.
book.
Yeah, yeah. The publisher was like, oh, they weren't huge on the subtitle of my book, which is Reclaiming Faithfulness as an Act of Rebellion. And they're like, oh, can we call it this thing or that thing? And I'm like, it's kind of the title of my book is not the thesis of my book. It's just a provocative invitation to, or almost like a dare to read the book. The thesis is more in the subtitle, which is Faithfulness as an Act of Rebellion. And as I was reading and researching and listening to people who are much smarter than me and who would write much better than I do, trying to find the thesis, which you can write a book that provides arguments for theological positions, or that provides answers to common quibbles amongst the deconstructionists, and my book does some of that. But those books exist. There's lots of them. Some of them are really good. I wanted to write a book about faithfulness, and I ended up reading, of all things, a collection of essays by one of my favorite novelists, who's a woman named Catherine Dunn. She wrote as a boxing journalist, of all things, on the side. So she was a novelist by trade, but for fun, she would write about boxing. She was just a boxing enthusiast. And she has this great essay where she describes a young man who comes into a gym looking for a master and wants to be an apprentice. It was a true story. And she watched as like this connection forms between the coach and the would-be fighter. And she describes it as like it requires so many factors to come together in the right way for that relationship to form, and for that person, the young man, to say, yes, I will train and I'll come back tomorrow. And I was so struck by that story and how much it symbolized, in a way, the journey of faith with Jesus, that I ended up writing about it in my book, because it's one thing to talk about conversion. It's one thing to talk about relationship with God. These are all real things and beautiful things. It's one thing to talk about even like the, kind of the afterlife questions and eternity and that kind of stuff. But to me, they all often leave out the conversation of long-term faithfulness and the journey of apprenticeship to a master, which is more like you come to the gym and you say, will you train me? And the master says, I will, but you have to do these things. And so you say, I will do these things. And you come back the next day and it gets harder, but that doesn't mean that it's not good.
And you're sore.
Yes,
you're like, this hurts.
Absolutely.
This is not really uncomfortable.
Yeah, which is why a lot of people end up leaving. A lot of people say, I don't want to do this anymore. This asks so much. But for others, they're like, it's the hardest thing I've ever done, but I will do it. And, and they keep coming back and they train through the soreness. And so we have like paradigms for this kind of thing. Everyone understands self-denial in the name of something like fitness or diet, or even in the arts, to master ballet or the piano. Yeah. But we often fail to carry those paradigms into the faith journey, that, to become a master pianist is going to take you a lifetime of training under a master, and it's going to be hard. And that doesn't mean that it's bad. If anything, it makes it better, because it's something that's going to require all of you, not just some of you. And the best things, anyone who loves someone deeply, who's had a friend for many years, understands that idea that the best things that in life are painful and ask a lot of you, but are deeply rewarding. Any parent knows that. Anyone who's been married knows that. Anyone with just long-term friendship knows that. So we already understand that self-denial is necessary for the best possible things in life, but it somehow derails us when it enters the conversation of faith or church or Jesus,
Yeah, because really, at the end of the day, only Jesus is the perfect example of what the reward of that hard work is. We have many giants of the faith that we have high regard for, but they were fallen too, including those who are in the Bible. When you look at people, if you look at fitness, for example, and you go into a gym, there's a whole bunch of people looking fit, that make you think, okay, I better get to it. It's like, I'm feeling pretty flabby when I go in there. It feels like there's more pictures of what it might look like. I think Jesus is so perfect that he feels so distant, as far as like, I'll never be like that. I know myself. I have a long way to go before I am like Jesus. God has a lot of work to do. And so, just like going to the gym where everyone is fit and you're not, it can be discouraging. It can make you feel like I can't fit here. I can't possibly accomplish that. And so I understand in a way why it is harder to buy into that. And plus, it's sometimes working on things that we don't want to work on, or that we don't even see are the problem. So many times God's working on something, he surprises me where I think I have an area of my life that's in good shape, and then he surprises me and shows me like, no, it's not. You got to work on that.
Yeah. It does that all the time. It's so frustrating.
Like, oh, yeah. Yes. You mentioned, in fact, you talked about the slow progress of discipleship. It isn't a quick, we're not going to, we go through a certain class at church and read the Bible enough times, or that it isn't going to be a quick fix. It's a journey and a slow process. You even mentioned, again, I might be conflating in my mind the book with some of the podcasts that I listen to about embracing the slowness of life, the slow moments of life. I really, I think this was in a podcast. You talked about being an Enneagram 4.
Mm-hmm.
Again, you weren't even saying much about the Enneagram per se, but more about that, describing kind of where your heart leans and how hard it is to rest in the simple, rest in the everyday, and see beauty in that, see God at work in that, because we want to accomplish things and have influence or have, so I related to you greatly as you were sharing about that, and versus accepting this slow process, I use the word journey because that's what I'm using a lot in my book, but this walk day by day, step by step. I really appreciated that you talked about that, because that's what's so unpopular too.
Yeah, it is.
Self-denial is very unpopular, and slow, super unpopular.
Yes, yes, yes. Neither one are great sales pitches for our respective
Maybe we
works.
need another predator, the predator of speed or expediency, or I don't know what the word
Yes.
might be.
Yeah, it's funny because that is my disposition, is that I don't by nature find great meaning and purpose in the slow and in the mundane, for lack of a better way of putting it. But it was actually my wrestling with the Bible that God used to open a door to a greater conversation He needed to have with me about accepting mundanity, and the beauty of the mundane. Because the paradigm I use in the book to describe the Bible's ideal reader is the one given by the psalmist. Blessed is the one who meditates on the Word of God day and night. And again, this is a thing that can be, and often is, and was for me in many ways. It feels hopelessly daunting in that, what, I've got to read this for the rest of my life just to start to scratch the surface. But then the more that I wrestled, the more that I found freedom in that paradigm, the freedom to not resolve all of the Bible's mysteries, or to, that doesn't mean that I don't have any views about what the Bible says. I do, they're in the book. But it gave me a lot of freedom to be less militant about many of them, and to find comfort in what often feels like the broad strokes of orthodoxy, and to have a specific opinion about, oh, I think maybe the Bible means this and this and this, and I teach as if those things are true, and I read and practice as if those things are true, but I also understand and give myself over to the process of lifetime meditation, and that I'm learning and growing with other disciples of Jesus along the way. And I can, again, draw from this rich resource of hundreds and hundreds of years of women and men who have been studying the scriptures before me and living out the scriptures before me. And the more that you accept the lifetime meditative work of learning the scriptures, the more that you can begin to accept the slow process of life itself and discipleship itself. There was a season of my discipleship where, when I was, I don't know, before I had kids and I was first starting seminary, where I studied the scriptures as if I was about to resolve them. Stacks of books, and okay, great, this is the best position on this. This guy has the best take on this. This lady has the best book on this. And honestly, there was a time and a place for that. I'm grateful for that process and that stage of learning, and the way that I prayed, and the way that I studied at that time, I think was right and fitting for that time. But now it's so much more contemplative and slow and, less goal-oriented, I guess I would say, and more relational. Even the reading of the scriptures is more relational. That doesn't mean that I don't ever read to learn anymore. I do. But even the way that the Bible came to be is such an affront to the modern sensibility. The idea that somebody had to write a letter, and then that letter had to make this journey across, the ancient Mediterranean that took days and months, and somebody would read it to a church, just, in front of a church, and roll the thing up and take it to the next place. And there would inevitably, I'm, presuming, be word murmurings that oh, did you hear Paul wrote a thing and it's making the circles? We don't have it yet, but I'm sure we don't come off great in that letter. and they just had to wait. They had to wait and learn and grow together with what they had at the time that they had it. Does not sit well with the people of Amazon Prime. That does not sit well
Yes.
with like kind of the immediate
The Netflix series.
Yes, exactly. Like we are used to binging the docuseries and coming to the conclusion that the docuseries offers by the end of the docuseries, not a lifetime of meditation. But when we resolve or resign ourselves rather to a lifetime of meditation, it opens the door to, a meditative way of life. And I know that sounds hopelessly mystic and stuff, but what I mean by that is a certain amount of comfort with the slow process of discipleship, and rather than becoming undone by, are you kidding me? I still, like you said earlier, that happens to me all the time. Like he points out something that this is what I have to work on. I thought I already did this. And that's still discouraging, but rather than becoming undone by it, we understand that, well, I mean, I'm still here, so I'm still growing.
New
Yep,
layer.
new layer, and here we go. We'll start this one. I'm not alone. I have people who will walk with me. And again, I have resources in the past, the present, and I will have them in the future. So we can become more comfortable with that slowness, but it's an uphill battle for us, for sure.
Yes, in fact, another thing that I appreciated in your book, you talk about the importance of community. How right that this is not something we do alone. While our journey with God is obviously personal and individual, our discipleship doesn't happen in a vacuum. So I 100% agree with you that the accountability, the importance of accountability, how we shape one another on the journey, while at the same time we can hurt one another, right?
Yes.
We do, because we're corrupt people who corrupt things. So very much I was like, yes, yes, yes. I have a chapter on my book called Travel and Community. And I argue for that community is not, it's important, it's essential, and it's a blessing, even if obviously it's messy, even if we causes of issues. So thank you for even putting that in there too. I was super excited. And then I also sense from the way you wrote the book and the way you've talked about it, even here in our conversation as we close, that you have kind of a touch with spiritual practices and kind of the importance of that reflection, which is yet another spiritual practice in itself. And so I also appreciated that. In my book, I put a spiritual practice or two at the end of every chapter as the practical way to live this out, because it's in the practice of these things that we grow on the journey of faith. And so, yeah, tell me about your relationship with spiritual practices. Is there any in particular that you would recommend or that you feel like really connects with your book, etc.?
Yeah, my journey I grew up in the church, so I had a paradigm for spiritual disciplines. And by that, I mean things like, as a Christian, you're supposed to pray and read your Bible. But it was a decidedly narrow paradigm. I grew up in a Southern Baptist church, and we talked about things like, I don't know, fasting or silence and solitude. We wouldn't have used that terminology, but conceptually they were kind of there, at least on the periphery, but not necessarily in practice. And it wasn't until I was in that stage that I described earlier of trying to read and consume and learn as much as possible in a small amount of time that I stumbled upon the spiritual formation tradition and the writers like Dallas Willard, or who had not just a high view of the spiritual disciplines, but understood them as necessary expressions of discipleship. And so now things that I understood and even practiced, like prayer and reading the Bible in the morning, things that I had been given from a young age and carried on into my adult discipleship, became more than just obligatory gestures of the Christian life, and more training drills for the person who is apprenticing under a master, to keep using those paradigms or metaphors. The person who shows up to the gym to learn boxing is given drills, is given practices, and they are taught, you do this and you do that, and that's how you learn to do these things. The drill to hit the punching bag is not the end it is a means to an end. And by doing this, you become a better overall fighter. Or the ballet dancer, on the bar. It's like the point is not to be on the bar and go up and down on your toes. The point is that you learn to be a ballet dancer by practicing these things, by the practices themselves. And suddenly my mind was opened, to the idea of like, oh, okay, well, it's not that I thought that prayer was burdensome or I just had to do it because I was Christian. I actually enjoyed praying, at least for the most part. I mean, I think prayer can be tedious or complicated for anyone who follows Jesus, but I understood these things differently. Now they became not just an obligatory expression of being a Christian, and more like this is the process of maturing as a disciple of Jesus. This is spiritual formation, to practice things like prayer, fasting, silence, and solitude, those kinds of things. And everyone who embarks on the spiritual formation journey with spiritual disciplines eventually learns that you kind of have downstream disciplines, the things that they come really easy to you because you like doing them, and then the upstream ones that you're like, I hate them, but I understand their yes, yes, but I understand their value. Much like in training in any kind of way of life. So
some people like the aerobics more than the weights, or vice versa.
Yeah, exactly. So, for someone who is wired like me, I actually enjoy getting up early and sitting in the dark and praying and reading my Bible while I, listen to music or something like that. It's not that, people are like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you do that. It's like, it's honestly, and not a kind of false modesty. It's not that hard because of my wiring. I like doing those things. I don't like to fast. But the first time I took on fasting, and this was I read a book by Scott McKnight about fasting, and I was doing some study. I think I had to teach on a passage that was about fasting. So I was like, great, well, now I have to learn this or I can't teach it with integrity. And I practiced it. It was not fun, but the experience was so overall rewarding. And I felt like a new kind of formation in that process. And I was like, well, great. Now this thing that I hate, it's like the doing, the bench press. If you hate doing bench press, but then afterward you're like, well, but it does work. So I've learned to, cobble together a rule of life, which is literally on paper like a list of, in this season of my life, these are the things that I do for this, the things that I do for this, the things that I do for this. And they include and balance upstream and downstream disciplines so that I don't only do the things that I already love to do all the time and never challenge myself, never deny myself, and instead include a rhythm for things like fasting. Like I fast a day every month. And if I waited for the occasion on which I felt like fasting, that occasion would be 0 times a year. But when I implement it, kind of with a disciplined consistency, I find that I don't like it anymore, but it becomes a necessary part of my training as a disciple of Jesus. So I think personally that they're becoming more and more a part of the, kind of spiritual pop culture conversation as things like overall wellness and mental health become more and more part of the pop culture zeitgeist. So that's great. I'm grateful for that. And that doesn't make them any easier, but I think more and more now, because of the writing of great and intelligent people like you who are including practices in their book instead of just
I'm learning with you.
Yeah. But
well, and that's the part, you in the Preorder list, as you added self-denial, I believe that the spiritual practices work on that aspect of our spiritual journey specifically, because you're making time for God.
Yes.
And saying no to yourself so you can say yes to God, and opening yourselves to, we open ourselves to whatever God wants to work on, no matter which practice we do, whether it's an easy one or one that's hard for us. It's that opening of, okay, I'm not myself anymore. I belong to my Father, and therefore I open myself for Him to instruct me, guide me. In your book, you call him the master and the apprentice. You kind of show up to the gym and with your gear and, okay, God, what are we going to work on today? Right?
Yeah, I agree totally. And, that's the counterintuitive thing about a lot of the disciplines, in that one way that fasting was encouraged to me was as a means of, and I think the quote was, starve the flesh to feed the spirit, which sounded at the time hopelessly esoteric and mystic. And I was like, okay, whatever. But the thing that ends up happening is almost like the way an athlete will practice drills of like holding their breath underwater, and seeing how long they can do that to build lung capacity, to build conditioning so that they can run farther or something. It seems like, why in the world am I holding my breath underwater if what I'm doing is running? But
Yes.
in fasting, what I learned is just that simple, practical base element of being able to say, I want to eat, my body wants to eat, and I practice some level of temporary mastery over my body and cravings to say, but I won't do it. I will deny myself, is like a conditioning drill that creates the possibility for me to say on a spiritual level to temptation, for example, like, I want to do this, but I will not do it because I'm training myself to, in the language of Paul, to not be mastered by anything, not even my cravings for something like food. So I agree. Yes, they are a means to an end, and the end is God.
Amen. Amen. Boy, that's a good place to end, although I have more questions, but I will stop here. Thank you. Thank you so much for this incredible time. Thank you for the obedience of writing your book as vulnerably as you did. I pray a special blessing on it. Obviously, the Lord knows who it's for. I just want you to know it's helped one person. At least it's helped me. And it's giving me language. I have people that I'm giving your book to because I know that they're in this place where they need to hear this. And I'm also encouraged as a writer myself because I felt the intuition to write about this. Very different angle, very different way of writing, etc. But I feel like the Holy Spirit is doing something in these books that are coming out right now that are addressing this mystery of the journey of faith. And as I see more books coming out like this, I realize, wow, God, you're the one at work here, and you're trying to speak to this generation or this time, this season, to us as believers in a very unique way, especially here in the West, where I think we're the ones seriously caught up right now with some of these hang-ups. I have friends in Turkey and Iran and India and Sri Lanka, and their problems are very, very different, and they're having their own challenges with their journey of faith, but they're different. And I'm grateful that God is ministering to us here in our struggle. So
likewise, thank you so much for having me. It was honestly a lot of fun.
Thank you for listening to Uncharted Podcast with Inés Franklin. Learn more about Inés at unchartedpod.com. Follow Inés' journey on Instagram at Inés Franklin. Sign up for our email list to receive direct access to online experiences and more. Thanks for listening, and join us again next time.